So guys, I've just made some major changes to my Vanguard tier list, which I'll be covering in this video. Prior to this update, I had ships like Hindenburg and Unzen in S tier for their top-of-the-line damage output, but recently, with the introduction of powerful and consistent main fleet buffers like Z52, Trafalgar, William D. Porter, and also an increase in main fleet damage from the likes of Lion, Mecklenburg, Fritz Rume, and also new equipment like the LA-9s and Mecklenburg guns, the presence of these damage-oriented ship in all content has diminished significantly. When Unzen and Hindenburg were at their best, they were dealing so much damage relative to the rest of the ships in the fleet that the buffers at the time could not keep up with their damage output. But with both buffers and main fleet ships getting stronger around them, they're no longer the dominant forces they once were. And just a note for people who haven't been here since the beginning of my tier lists, obviously you'll have noticed that the tier list is missing a lot of ships. I only include ships that I feel are good enough to make it into B tier, which is dictated by the strength of the other ships in B tier, with an arbitrary cutoff because there has to be a cutoff somewhere. I also don't include ships that I haven't used, which is going to be a lot of collab ships and meta ships. I want to keep only ships I'm familiar with in my tier list to be as accurate as possible, but occasionally there will be ships that I used a lot in the past, but haven't used in a long time and misjudged them relative to some of the newer ships as a result. Alright, getting into the changes now. The first 4 ships haven't changed at all. Z52 is that ship that just has no weaknesses, and quite frankly, if a ship isn't better than her in at least some aspect, while being close in others, they're going to have a hard time being in the same tier as her. Next, Eldritch Retrofit changed what it means to be a tank with her incredibly broken invulnerability buff. If it weren't for her, you'd probably be seeing more tanks like large cruisers and Napoli in the S tier. She's also the most consistent provider of a slowing effect from the Vanguard, being enough by herself to make pretty much all main fleet damage aside from aimed torpedo bombers very consistent. Next up is Trafalgar, whose claim to fame is her reliable 10% evasion rate debuff against all types of enemies. Because of how damage is calculated in the game, minus 10% evasion rate is a huge damage increase, especially for the main fleet. It also certainly helps that the best main fleet ship in the game at the moment, Lion, is HMS and receives an extra 10% firepower from Trafalgar. Apart from her evasion rate debuff, her anti-air and anti-submarine are also top class, planting her solidly within S tier. I also want to take this opportunity to debunk this conspiracy theory some people have about how meta fights are always designed around the new UR. It seems like this pattern holds except when it doesn't. I mean, yes, there was Algeria meta shortly after Bismarck's Way was released, but there are just about as many cases where the new meta is terrible for the new URs. For instance, when Yorktown 2 was released, both the meta fight and the Arbiter of the Month were heavy armor, so there was pretty much no content to use her in. Remember when Fritz Rume came out, and people thought that she was weak because the meta boss was Taiho meta with heavy armor? And by the way, there hasn't been a single heavy armor boss since Hakuo was released, and she was the star of the Japanese anniversary, which everyone knows there tends to be a bias toward. There were even people expecting that the most recent event ships would have summons just because of Yorktown meta fight, and we know how that turned out. The same thing kind of happened with Trafalgar too. She came out during back-to-back destroyer meta bosses, and players have a tendency to associate destroyers with high evasion, so some people thought, if she's not even the best against the destroyer, then she can't be that good. While the correlation between destroyers and high evasion is true for our destroyers, it's not really the case for enemy destroyers relative to other classes, especially in the recent meta showdowns. Add to this the fact that Chapayev and Aurora are the only real competition for her evasion rate debuff, and they both just happen to work against destroyers. Some people probably thought that Trafalgar was as good as a purple ship. However, now that we're fighting a medium armor meta boss and there's typically only one real slot in the Vanguard for a non-summon ship, it's clear as day that Trafalgar's debuff provides the most damage consistently out of all the Vanguards, including the likes of Z52 and Plymouth. And pretty much Helena is the only one who's able to topple her damage ceiling, but at a much less consistent rate. Okay, moving on, we have Plymouth. She's been around for so many years now, so everyone should be aware of how good she is. Following that is the new UR destroyer, William D. Porter. I haven't tested her in depth because I'm still leveling her right now, but her strengths are very clear, being a well-rounded ship like all the other ships in S tier, while providing powerful buffs for USS ships and whoever the flagship is. I think her ceiling is just below Trafalgar, and her floor is the bottom of S tier, but I'll have to finish raising her first and test her out thoroughly to be certain. Finally, we have Laffy 2, who excels at everything except damage output. The same can be said for Eldritch, but her slow actually increases the damage of your fleet by a lot when it's needed, and her invulnerability buff is much more game warping than Laffy just being unkillable on her own, which is a trait shared by a few other ships. I wouldn't be mad if someone put her a bit higher on the tier list, but I'm a fan of damage, so I left her at the bottom of S tier. Moving on, we are now in the S star tier. These ships have skills with extremely powerful effects, but they're also very situational. You just need to read their abilities, and if they're applicable, then it's a no-brainer to include them in your fleet. They oftentimes even surpass the S tier ships in the right situation. For example, Chapayev has a 10% evasion rate debuff against only destroyers that is active all the time, on top of her solid personal damage and damage buff for other Vanguard ships. If you're against a destroyer enemy with non-negligible evasion, she's literally Thanos and provides more damage than pretty much all other ships. Helena's debuff provides the most damage out of all Vanguards but only has a 60% chance to activate, and then Aurora provides the most powerful evasion rate debuff but is only applicable to destroyers and light cruisers, and keeping alive is another condition in its own. Next up is the AA tier. All these ships are really good even without their anti-air, but anti-air is the thing they're primarily known for. I'll quickly go over the strengths of each ship. Sandy has pretty much the best AA when accounting for the AA buff she grants to the entire fleet. Her damage and survivability are solid, and she also has the best anti-submarine performance out of all non-destroyers, being about as good as an average destroyer. Guam is a typical large cruiser aside from her anti-air, having both good damage and survivability. She also has a use in boss fights with her permanent armor brick, allowing her to output even more damage than Hindenburg with a full battleship fleet, because the most recent battleships are much stronger than the ones from before. Shimanto, Howden Leu, and Provincian all have a bit of healing. Shimanto also has the niche of putting out fires from your entire fleet, and Howden Leu is quite tanky. Without their anti-air, I think Guam is the best ship, probably going into A tier based on her stats and armor break debuff, while the others would probably be in B tier. 4 of the ships in S tier have almost as much anti-air as the ships in the anti-air tier, but their anti-air is the cherry on top. They do many things well, even without accounting for their anti-air. Alright, moving on to A tier. First we have Kazagumo, who I think will be more valuable than Unzen for the next big heavy armor boss, especially with the addition of Hakuho. Next are Hindenburg and Unzen, who still do the most damage out of all Vanguard ships, but that alone isn't enough anymore, as I explained before. It's hard to see them going back up at this point, because their loadouts already consist of almost fully rainbow equipment, so if any pure damage dealers make it into S tier, it'll probably be the next cycle of power creep with ships that deal much more damage than them. Next up is Bayard, who is probably the highest damaging Vanguard in campaign, with her insane barrages and amazing stats. I'd probably rather use Bayard than Unzen and Hindenburg in campaign because she's tankier and more self-sufficient, so depending on what content you care more about, you could argue that she should be even above them, and maybe even above Kazagumo. After that is Mogador. She's a pretty unique ship, being particularly good in fights where the Vanguard takes a lot of damage because her constant invulnerability procs make her survive longer than normal tanks that rely on their HP and evasion. She also had a niche against heavy bosses because she could set up Unzen's torpedoes by dragging the Vanguard forward when she does her lunge attack, and her debuff also increases the damage of all your torpedoes and torpedo bombers, but with the release of recent ships that are even more suited toward heavy armor like Z-52 and Trafalgar, she's no longer needed for that role. Even though her best use cases are quite niche, not unlike those in S-star tier, her niche is now less relevant than those in S-star tier, and her survivability and damage in a normal context is more in line with the other A tiers. Next up is Ibuki. She's very similar to Unzen, trading Unzen's consistent damage for a stronger preload, but other than that, she's not super different. Finally, we have Napoli. She's tanky and her damage is solid, putting her in fringe A tier off stats alone, but it's really hard to find a good place to use her. The recently released Chapter 14 hard mode could have been a good place for her, but her damage against heavy is pretty bad, which is important in Chapter 14, and there's a light cruiser lock in both fleets, so it's hard to just slot in a tank without accounting for other things. Moving on now to B tier, we have 3 more tanks that aren't as tanky as Napoli, but offer other things. Brest has a little heal for another ship every battle, making her potentially better for mob fleets. Aegir has a slow and armor break and is better for bossing, but Eldritch does her job better, and she hasn't been seeing much use since Eldritch got her retrofit. Anchorage has fallen off because, by today's standards, her damage is subpar, and her tankiness has been powercrafted by newer ships. Next up are 5 light cruisers that are all quite good in campaign, with their good balance of damage and survivability. Obviously, Momo and Kurumi are super core for the current meta fight due to their summons, but they're also very capable even outside of that meta fight. Their summons are actual units on the field, so they can tank the suicide ships for your main fleet in campaign, which is very useful to have, especially in Chapter 14. On top of that, Momo has various support effects that are hard to notice but add up to give your fleet more consistent performances, and Kurumi, with a constant supply of clones, is just unkillable. Next, Noshiro has really high damage output in campaign, similar to that of Bayard's, with solid survivability as well, and she also gives the entire Vanguard powerful buffs. Her damage is really poor against a single enemy though, as most of it comes from her unique Augment Barrage, which has an activation rate of 80%, meaning that in very rare occasions it can let you down. Watarase also deals a lot of damage, but her performance is tied to the flagship you choose, which can vary depending on basically whether you use her with Musashi or not. And that restrictiveness makes me like her less than some of these other light cruisers, plus the fact that she's not the most tanky, but she's still capable of pumping DPS like crazy. Neptune just deals good damage and is good at surviving with her pretty big zombie heal, making her a good option for tanking in campaign. She doesn't offer much else though, and nothing special that the ships in front of her don't offer, so she might get dropped off soon. The next 3 are the Vanguards that deal the most damage against light armor specifically, after Hindenburg. I thought that Fushun would deal more damage than Taiyuan because of her buffs, but after using them together, I found that Taiyuan actually outperforms Fushun consistently. I'm also not super sure if they're stronger than St. Louis. What I am certain of is that St. Louis is easier to keep alive, but the DDG's damage is much more consistent as none of their damage really misses. I'll test them out against some light armor boss later down the line to see which one is actually the best. Next up is Jinsu Meta. She's somewhat of a tank and a torpedo buffer, similar to Noshiro. I'm gonna test her out a bit more in Chapter 14, but in the past she's been good for heavy armor meta fights because she can tank most of the fight, die before the end, and fire out 2 more salvos of torpedoes. That's probably not needed anymore with the newer Vanguard buffers, so if she turns out to be not amazing in Chapter 14, she might be next on the chopping block. Next up is Shimakaze. There's little reason to use her these days with much stronger options that are also easier to keep alive. I think she's still stronger than the ships I left off from the last version to this one, but her time is probably coming to an end as much as I hate to say it. Next up is Aurora. With Vanguard damage dealers falling off, there's even less reason to bring her, so this change reflects that. After that, we have Sirius. She's also fallen off in favor of better buffers. For a carrier composition against light armor, I would value her about as much as the DDGs and St. Louis, and maybe she'll see some use with Lexington too, but she's also on the verge. Her main issue is that her own damage is just way too low. Finally, we have Yukikaze. She's one of the weaker ships damage-wise in the tier list, but her damage is much better than before her unique augment, and she has a lot of main fleet protection. The best form of main fleet protection is still just killing the enemies before they can reach your main fleet, so I put her at the end of the list. There are some ships I left off like Felix Schultz or Kronstadt that are much worse than the likes of Neptune, but I think there are enough ships on here already. Okay, that's it for this update of the tier list. Let me know what you think, whether you agree or disagree. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.